Oh, yes, we're big on the economy this morning. I think every other day as well. We're joined now by the World Bank Country Director for Nigeria, Mr. Ndiame Diop. He's live in our Abuja studio. Welcome to the Morning Brief, Mr. Diop.
Good morning.
Well,
thanks for having me.
Good to have you. The World Bank just released that report for Nigeria, and you've spoken about it, about Nigeria's economic trajectory, how it is commendable on the one hand. You also acknowledge, the challenges being faced as a result of inflation, rising costs and the rest. So perhaps you might want to speak more on that. It's quite an interesting dynamic here. There's commendations on the one hand, like you're going in the right direction, but you're acknowledging that this direction you're going in is also not favorable to some people. So how do you balance that?
No, thank you very much. I think it's important to start with the situation we faced in 2022, because these reforms that the government has been implementing are course correction reforms. So it's really important to go back to 2022. At the time, PMS subsidy represented 4.5 trillion. FX subsidy, which is essentially remitting government fiscal revenues at a lower exchange rate, lower than the market rate, represented about 6 trillion naira. So the total revenue foregone by the government was about 10 trillion naira. That's about 5.2% of GDP. This is a very large amount. And the extremely low revenue that has resulted from that has led to higher fiscal deficit, which was financed mainly by ways and means. The total accumulated stock of ways and means was about 11.2%. That's more than $30 billion. That's very, very, very large. And this is deficit monetization. When the central bank finances fiscal deficit, and there is a disconnect between money supply growth and GDP growth, the result is inflation. Essentially, money supply was going this way, and then GDP was sort of flat or slightly declining, which essentially means that you cannot avoid an acceleration of inflation. So the reforms have really meant first to avoid Nigeria falling off the cliff, and undergoing a very significant economic and fiscal crisis. Now, fast forward today, what we see in the data is very, very clear. Thanks to the major FX policy and management reforms and the fiscal reforms implemented since May 2023, what we are seeing now is government revenue increasing, which is not surprising because the FX subsidy and the FX premium have been eliminated. And we're seeing a quite significant increase in revenue already in 2024. And going forward with the recent deregulation of PMS prices, government revenues, or the revenues flowing to the Federation is projected to increase quite significantly. And this is a very major turnaround because it will allow the government to have resources to invest more in education, health, critical infrastructure to support the non-oil growth economy, which is critical to create jobs. Now, by their very nature, these reforms that are course-correcting reforms really entail some major challenges, right? Inflation is quite high. Interest rate is very high as well. And there is a cost of living crisis in Nigeria. Everybody is hurt. The elite is hurt, middle class, but also the poor. But the difference between the higher middle class and the sort of high income categories and the poor is that the poor don't have buffer. So it's really important to really target the poor and the vulnerable, support them, support farmers, support local SMEs that are facing high interest rate. so that you can mitigate the social cost of the necessary reforms that have been implemented.
Well, Mr. Diop, the report from your confirmation says that macroeconomic situation is improving and encouraging. And you have also rightly noted that the removal of subsidies have led to an increase in the resources available from government to government, to fund budget. But at the subnationals, what we're seeing more is an increase in the debt incurred by the subnationals. They're borrowing more even now. And external debt, according to data provided by the Office of Statistics here in the country, shows that the external debt that the subnationals have incurred is $1.9 billion. So the question is, where are the gains of the removal of subsidy, to Nigeria? They are few and far between, and the vulnerable are really suffering. So the reforms are yet to, bring in accruable results.
No, and you're absolutely right. And this is why we are saying in the report, one of the key messages is to stay the course, right? It is important when you do these reforms and you start seeing the early gains or the reform dividend, to really stay the course so that those benefits are consolidated in the next few years. Staying the course basically means keeping the laser focus that CBN has on fighting inflation. It also means really using the savings from the PMS removal, subsidy removal, the FX subsidy removal, to really invest in boosting non-oil growth and job creation. And that requires a competitive exchange rate, which Nigeria has now. It requires investing part of the savings from the reforms into critical infrastructure to support the private sector and to support growth. It requires also investing in fixing power, improving security, etc., which are all important to really support the non-oil economy and support job creation. So we are in, after 1 year of reform, and Nigeria has been in this situation before. Between 2003 and 2007, Nigeria has implemented major macro fiscal reforms that have really led to significant benefit and a large fiscal buffer that has allowed Nigeria to actually implement counter-cyclical policy during the global financial crisis in 2008, 2009, and to stabilize the economy. But those reforms have really not been consolidated.
Well, Mr. Diop,
afterwards. And this is why we are sort of permanently making 2 steps forward
right,
and 2 steps backward. And you don't progress really in development if you are not consistently keeping the course of reforms and then really implementing good public policy, over time. So this is really,
Diop,
really important. Now,
let me quickly follow up. Pardon me, Mr. Diop. Let me quickly follow up with the stay in the course bits. Because when you say stay the course, what a lot of people hear is continue with this hardship. Don't forget that they've been going through this for over a year now. So when they hear stay in the course, they think, what? Haven't we had enough already? This is a time, particularly because there's a phrase here, let the poor breathe. And of course, the president is famous for that. So they wonder, when will the poor really breathe? So when they hear stay the course, that's what they hear, continue with the suffering. In fact, some of them are not happy with institutions like the World Bank because they say, it's your advice, remove subsidy that got Nigeria where it is right now. And I'm sure you've heard that time and again. But you talked about providing buffer for the vulnerable. And I think that is what has been missing, really, getting the vulnerable to have that buffer so that you're not doing one thing and commending yourselves, but the people see another thing. So how do we fine tune that bit so people can align with the government if indeed government is doing the right thing?
Yeah, no, thank you for giving me the opportunity to clarify that. Nothing is better for people suffering from the cost of living crisis than good public policy. Because good public policy is what will get them out of the situation we are in. Now, when we say keep, stick to the plan or stay the course, essentially, I mentioned earlier, one of the things we mean there is keep fighting inflation. Keeping fighting inflation is good for people. It's good for citizens. Reducing inflation, in particular food inflation, is absolutely important to really support, people that are really struggling with high inflation. Accelerating the rollout of social transfer, which is very important. The government is doing it right now. Now, the authentication of people in the social registry using NIN and BVN has made the pace of rollout a bit slower than expected. But it is important to stay the course of supporting the poor and the vulnerable using this cash transfer. It's absolutely important. It's important to stay the course of reallocating the savings from the subsidy to education, to health, so we meant it in a very positive way. We meant it also to mean supporting the population, investing more in health, investing more in education, investing more in critical infrastructure, and keeping the course of fighting inflation. All of those things are really extremely important for the citizen. And in fact, when you keep the course as we meant it, essentially that means that you really are focusing on reducing the suffering of population. That's really what we mean by that. Well, and you cannot do it by reverting to public policies that actually would sort of put us back into the situation of 2022. That's really what we meant.
Well, Mr. Diop, we just asked an economist at home here about the viability of that social program, and he said that, social transfers are good, but they're not encouraging productivity because you're just transferring money to the people. That's on the one hand. You may want to speak to that. But, developed countries are providing intervention in critical areas. The Farm Bill in the US, for instance, has seen 11 billion naira in subsidies go to the agriculture sector. There are reports also that there's subsidy for the petroleum sector in the US to the tune of 7 trillion naira. But why does the World Bank continue to advocate for the removal of subsidies in Nigeria, which is evidently hurting the country? And you talk about staying the course. Nigerians are asking, how long for this hardship? How long will we continue in this hardship before we exit?
So, number one, accelerating the rollout of social transfer is absolutely critical and urgent. So that's number one. Number two, using the savings. I mentioned earlier that these reforms have led to a quite significant increase in revenues, fiscal revenues flowing to the federation, and using that revenue to really invest in people, in things that increase productivity is absolutely critical. I fully agree with you. In the long term, even in the medium term, what would really help people is to create jobs. And to create jobs, you need investment and you need to increase productivity. So, but if you don't have revenues, the government cannot just support productive sectors, support infrastructure, support education, support health, if there is no revenues. So it is absolutely critical to really use the savings from these reforms to do exactly what you are saying, ma'am. And I think that's the goal. The goal is to raise productivity, to increase support to people that are really being affected by the high high inflation, and ultimately to really get to a situation, perhaps in the very relatively reasonable period of time. And when we say stay the course, this really doesn't mean the continuation of suffering the population. Of course, that nobody wants that. What we are saying is essentially just improve public policy and use those, the sort of early dividend or benefit from the reforms you're doing to invest in your people, to invest in their health, invest in their education, to invest in critical infrastructure, to invest in research and development in agriculture, to really increase the productivity of this economy, create more jobs, so that the welfare of the population will increase on a sort of sustained basis. This is the recipe of all the countries that have moved from, low income to middle income to high income. So
well,
this
Mr.
is
Diop,
really what we are really talking about.
and
It's really, and I'm sorry that perhaps this was misinterpreted by many. The objective of staying the course is staying the course of the good public policy that have been initiated, so that the impact on the population will be felt sooner rather than later, and hopefully in the next 2 years, really seeing the suffering of the population really ending.
wow, we have another conversation really about the speed of these interventions, which, by the way, should have come over a year ago, and not trying to play catch up, right? But we have to thank you so much. It's important to get these sorts of ideas in the mix, so we can look at them and say, okay, how do we deploy these ideas and use that for creative solutions. But I have to thank you so much, the World Bank Country Director for Nigeria. Perhaps you'll be meeting UNICEF very soon, Mr. Ndiame Diop. Thank you for your time. I wish you the very best.
Thank you very much.